chilling ring shattered the stillness of the night, reverberating through the empty streets of Sunset Ridge. The midnight call sent shockwaves through the dispatcher's voice, a report of a violent crime unfolding at the Hayes residence. Within minutes, the quiet luxury of the neighborhood was broken, replaced by the harsh blare of sirens and flashing lights. A murder had occurred, and nothing would ever be the same. Police arrived at the Hayes mansion to find Catherine Hayes, the once immaculate figure of elegance, sprawled on the cold marble floor. Her lifeless body was surrounded by pools of blood, the vivid red staining the otherwise pristine home. Stab wounds marred her body, each one a sign of the deadly fury that had been unleashed in her world. The house, once filled with the hum of wealth and comfort, now felt hollow and cold, as if it had absorbed the violent shock of her death. Detectives moved quickly, but their minds couldn't escape the thought, what had led to this? In the foyer, Michael Hayes paced back and forth, his appearance in stark contrast to the sophisticated businessman the world knew. His eyes were wild with confusion, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Catherine, his wife, his partner, was gone. He couldn't comprehend it, couldn't piece together how his perfect life had been ripped apart. Yet, as the chaos swirled around him, an unsettling realization began to form. Something had been wrong. Something had been festering beneath the surface of their marriage for far too long. The investigation turned to questions of why. This wasn't a random act of violence. It was personal. The detectives found traces of an affair. Catherine had been involved with a younger man, Ethan Wilder, someone who had crept into her life under the guise of passion. But the affair had spiraled into something darker, a toxic manipulation. As the truth emerged, Catherine's life, once a picture of affluence, became a tangled web of betrayal. Her marriage had crumbled beneath the weight of loneliness and emotional manipulation, and now, it seemed, her tragic end was the price she had paid for trusting the wrong people. The case was a labyrinth of deception, where the murder was just the beginning of unraveling the truth. Catherine Hayes had everything anyone could want: money, luxury, and a marriage that outwardly appeared perfect, yet she felt trapped in a gilded cage, her beauty and intellect unable to fill the emotional void that stretched endlessly before her. At 42, Catherine's world had become a sterile routine, built around a man who was more interested in building his empire than building a connection with her. Michael Hayes, her husband, was a successful businessman in his mid-40s. He worked long hours, his focus consumed by wealth and status, leaving little room for the intimacy Catherine craved. Every evening he came home, exchanged pleasantries, and retreated into his study or the gym. Catherine, alone in their vast empty mansion, began to feel like a ghost in her own life. The love they once shared had evaporated, replaced by silence and the monotony of marriage without passion. As days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the loneliness gnawed at her, consuming what was left of her spirit. She needed someone to see her, truly see her, and Michael no longer did. That was when Ethan Wilder entered her life. Ethan was young, only 24, but there was something magnetic about him. A personal trainer at the gym where Catherine worked out, he was the kind of man who noticed people. Really noticed them. He saw Catherine not just as a wealthy woman, but as someone who needed to be heard. His troubled past mirrored her own sense of emotional emptiness. And soon, their interactions grew more than just polite small talk. He was attentive in a way Michael had never been. And slowly, Catherine found herself drawn to him. It started innocently, casual flirtation during gym sessions. But as the weeks went on, Ethan's charm pulled her in deeper. He wasn't just flirty, he was present in a way Michael could never be. With Ethan, Catherine felt alive. He listened, his touch lingering just long enough to make her feel desired. And when he kissed her for the first time, it was everything Michael hadn't been for years. Passionate, reckless, and urgent. Catherine's heart raced, and for the first time in ages, she felt seen. As their affair bloomed, Catherine became addicted to the validation Ethan offered. She began to crave their stolen moments more than anything else. What had started as a brief escape from her lonely life quickly spiraled into an obsession. Ethan's attentiveness, his hunger for her in a way Michael no longer had, consumed her. She was torn between guilt and desire. Every kiss was a promise. Every stolen moment a glimpse into a world where she wasn't just the neglected wife of a wealthy businessman, she was a woman who mattered. But with each passing day, the guilt began to creep in, gnawing at her soul. She wasn't just betraying Michael, she was betraying herself. In flashbacks, Catherine's emotional turmoil deepened. The line between guilt and desire blurred. The drinking began to desire the whole lot. At first, she tried to hold on to her life with Michael, tried to justify the affair as something that would end once she felt validated. But as her connection to Ethan deepened, her marriage to Michael seemed to disintegrate further. She found herself choosing Ethan, not just because of his passion, but because he made her feel alive in a way her marriage could never do. She wanted to leave Michael, to escape the suffocating emptiness that had become her life, but her attachment to wealth and status held her back. The fear of losing everything that came with her marriage kept her chained. Ethan pushed her to make a choice. He had been patient at first, but now his pressure mounted. He wanted her to leave Michael, to run away with him and start fresh. Catherine, filled with longing and desire, found herself questioning everything. Could she leave Michael for Ethan? Was the passion and freedom she shared with Ethan worth the cost of abandoning her old life? One night, after an argument with Michael about their marriage's growing distance, Catherine felt herself spiraling. She spent the night with Ethan, their time together a blur of urgency and raw need. The next day, she couldn't look at herself in the mirror. She had never felt more alive, yet the shame of betrayal overwhelmed her. She couldn't go back to Michael after what she had done, but leaving everything behind for Ethan seemed just as impossible. Meanwhile, Michael began to notice the cracks forming in their marriage. Catherine had grown distant, her moods erratic, her behavior increasingly hard to predict. At first, he tried to bury his suspicions, focusing on work and pretending nothing was wrong. But the subtle signs were becoming too much to ignore. He saw the hidden phone, the late-night absences, and a change in the way she looked at him. He couldn't understand what had happened, but he felt it. The distance between them had widened beyond repair. Michael's suspicions grew stronger. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something felt off. Yet, he wasn't ready to confront Catherine. His own fears of abandonment paralyzed him, making him avoid the truth. Deep down, he was terrified of what the truth would mean, not just for their marriage, but for his ego and the perfect life he had built around her. The tension between Catherine and Michael was reaching a breaking point. Catherine, caught between the demands of her affair and the pressures of her marriage, could no longer maintain the facade. Ethan's insistent demands to leave Michael became unbearable, and her guilt over betraying her husband began to eat away at her. She felt trapped in a web of lies and broken promises, with no escape in sight. But it was too late. The lies had taken root, and the consequences of her choices were closing in. Catherine sat at the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the reflection in the full-length mirror. Her chest tightened as she adjusted her hair, but nothing seemed to ease the knot in her stomach. She had everything, but still, the emptiness gnawed at her. She felt like a stranger in her own life. Her thoughts drifted to Ethan, the young man from the gym, always offering a smile, a compliment, a word of encouragement. His presence had become an addiction, slowly filling the cavernous hole Michael had left. Michael's indifference was suffocating, but Ethan made her feel something. "You're more than just a wife," Ethan's words echoed in her mind, his voice low and full of promise. "You're someone worth looking at." At first, she'd brushed it off as flattery, but over the weeks, his compliments had become her lifeline. "You blew me away, Beth Ann, and prompted from out of me." Her reaction was longer. At the same time, her mind blinked. Every word he said seemed to soothe the pain of her hollow marriage, drawing her closer to him. It wasn't just the physical attraction. It was the way he made her feel alive again, and she didn't know how to stop it. Ethan knew exactly what he was doing. He had recognized Catherine's vulnerability from the moment she stepped into the gym. He had played it slow at first, keeping their interactions innocent, but now the lines had blurred. One night, as they sat together after a workout, Ethan leaned in closer, his fingers brushing against hers. "You know," he began, his tone dripping with sympathy, "I've noticed the way he looks at you. Michael doesn't see you for who you really are. He's too caught up in his own world." Catherine's breath hitched. She had never spoken of her frustrations to anyone, especially not to Ethan, but now his words felt like a truth she had been too afraid to acknowledge. "You deserve more than this," he continued, his voice soft yet insistent. "Don't let him control you. You're a beautiful woman, Catherine, but he doesn't deserve you." The seed was planted, and Catherine, desperate for affirmation, began to see everything in a new light. She couldn't help but wonder if Ethan was right, if Michael truly didn't care the way he once had. Catherine sat at the dining room table, pushing her food around. Michael, across from her, spoke absent-mindedly about his day, but all she could hear was the pounding of her own heart. The guilt was overwhelming. She had always believed in her marriage. She had convinced herself that, no matter how emotionally distant Michael had become, they had something solid. But Ethan made her feel seen. He filled the void in ways she couldn't explain. The more time she spent with him, the more detached she felt from Michael. But every time she looked at Michael, at the man who had built her life, who had given her everything material she could ever want, she was consumed with guilt. "I don't think I'm cut out for this," Catherine whispered one night, sitting on the edge of their bed. Michael looked up from his papers, startled. "What do you mean?" "I feel like I'm losing myself," she confessed, her voice barely audible. Michael's expression softened, but it wasn't the warmth she once felt. "You're not losing anything, you're just tired." But Catherine knew it wasn't just exhaustion. It was something deeper, something she wasn't ready to admit to herself. Michael began to notice the small things first. The late nights, the quiet, secretive phone calls, Catherine's distant demeanor. At first he chalked it up to stress. He was working long hours after all, and maybe she was feeling the strain of their life. But as days turned into weeks, the nagging feeling in his gut grew. "Where were you last night?" he asked one evening, unable to ignore his suspicions any longer. "I called. You didn't pick up." Catherine stiffened, her eyes darting away from his. "I was out with some friends." His mind raced. He couldn't pinpoint why, but something was off. The change in her behavior was too noticeable to ignore. Her eyes no longer sparkled with the warmth he remembered. She seemed absent, but still, he pushed it away. He didn't want to confront the possibility of what she might be hiding. After all, he was the one who had neglected her. He was the one who had driven her to this point. Ethan's patience had run out. Catherine's hesitations, her refusal to fully leave Michael, were beginning to drive him mad. His obsession had grown darker, more intense. He would show up uninvited at her house, leaving gifts at her doorstep when she wasn't there, calling her incessantly. "You can't keep playing both sides," Ethan said one evening, his voice laced with frustration. "You either choose me, or you lose everything." Catherine felt a cold chill sweep over her. She loved Ethan, but she also feared him. His manipulations had slowly twisted her mind, and now his demands felt suffocating. "If you love me, you'll leave him," he insisted, his eyes hard. "I'm not going to wait forever. You think Michael cares about you? He doesn't. He never did. Yet that's what he did. He loved me." Her chest tightened. "I don't know if I can do that." "Then you don't love me." Ethan's words were sharp, and Catherine flinched. The pressure to choose, to make a decision, was overwhelming. She feared she was slipping, losing her grip on everything. As Catherine's behavior grew more erratic, Michael became desperate. He couldn't ignore his instincts anymore. Something was wrong. He hired a private investigator. It was a decision that would irrevocably change everything. The investigator trailed Catherine, documenting her movements, taking photos when she left the house, when she met with Ethan. Michael watched the reports come in, the photos a painful confirmation of what he had feared. Catherine wasn't just drifting away. She was having an affair. It was a crushing blow. His mind spiraled as he read the reports, his thoughts consumed by anger and confusion. But what Michael didn't realize was that his actions were pushing Catherine further into Ethan's arms. She felt cornered, exposed. Her secret life, once a refuge, now felt like a trap. As Catherine's emotional dependence on Ethan grew, so did his instability. His charm began to crack. The lies he had spun to keep her close started unraveling, revealing a past full of manipulation and deceit. Ethan had done this before, charming women, seducing them, using them to get what he wanted. Catherine was just the latest in a long line of women he had preyed upon, but now his obsession with her was different. She wasn't just another conquest. She was his anchor. And he wasn't about to let her go. He began to stalk her, showing up unannounced at her house, waiting for her outside the gym, sending threatening messages when she pulled away. The hold he had over her tightened with every encounter. His obsession with control became a dark, consuming force. Catherine felt like she was suffocating. Michael's suspicions were now confirmed, the private investigator's findings hanging over her like a dark cloud. Ethan's demands had turned into threats. She was trapped between two worlds. One where she was trapped in a loveless marriage, and another where Ethan's obsessive love was quickly becoming a nightmare. Every choice felt like it would destroy her. No matter what path she took, someone would be shattered. The pressure reached its breaking point. Catherine was no longer just a woman torn between two lovers. She was a woman standing at the edge, about to lose everything. Michael had always been a man of control. Everything in his life was neatly arranged, predictable, and safe. Until that night. He came home late, the house silent and dimly lit. Catherine wasn't in the living room, where she often waited for him, no matter how late. He found her in the kitchen, her back to him as she stared into the refrigerator, her posture stiff as if bracing for something. He didn't need to say it aloud. He could see the guilt in the way she held herself, in the way she turned slowly when she heard him enter. "She became later, Catherine," he said, voice low. "What the hell is this?" She didn't need to ask what he meant. The phone. Her phone sat on the counter between them, still glowing with a message from Ethan. "I miss you. I'm here whenever you're ready to leave him." Michael's fingers shook as he reached for it. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she wanted to say something, anything to explain. But the words wouldn't come. The silence grew thick, suffocating. "I thought you loved me," Michael said, a quiet accusation lacing his words. The hurt was evident, but it didn't stop the anger that followed. His face twisted into something unrecognizable. Was this all a lie all these years? "No," Catherine whispered, her voice breaking. "Michael, it wasn't." "Don't," he interrupted sharply. "Don't you dare try to explain. This is unforgivable." His hand slammed down on the counter, the sound echoing through the empty house. His pulse pounded in his ears, the adrenaline surging. Catherine stepped forward, trying to reach him, but his eyes were cold. His anger burned so brightly, she felt as though she were suffocating in it. "Please," she said, tears welling up. "I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen." "Sorry?" Michael spat, his voice full of venom. "Sorry," Michael spat, his voice full of venom. "Sorry isn't going to fix this, Catherine. You let someone else into our bed, into my life, and you think a few tears will make it go away?" She opened her mouth to argue, but he was already shaking his head, unable to hear it anymore. "I'll expose you," he threatened, his words laced with an almost calm fury. "Everyone will know what you did. You'll lose everything." She recoiled, as if struck. "You can't. Michael, please. I was wrong. I'm ready to fix this, please." Michael's lips curled into a bitter smile. "It's too late for that." Hours later, the house was still and silent. Catherine had retreated to the bedroom, but her mind raced, the weight of what she'd done pressing down on her chest. The air felt thick, suffocating. She barely heard the knock at the door, nor did she recognize the desperation in Ethan's voice as he called her name from the other side. She had tried to end things, told him it was over, but the emotions, his presence, his touch, had tangled her mind. She opened the door, but before she could speak, he stepped inside, pushing the door closed behind him. "You think you can just walk away from me?" Ethan hissed, his eyes wild with hurt and anger. "I'm sorry, Ethan," Catherine said, her voice trembling. "But it's over. It has to be. Michael, he knows everything. I've ruined everything." Ethan's expression shifted, something dark creeping into his features. "You think that's going to stop me? You think I'll just let you go?" "No!" she whispered, backing away, her heart pounding in her chest. "But I'm done with this. I'm done with you." His face twisted in disbelief. "You're done?" "You don't get to decide that, Catherine." He moved toward her, his steps unsteady, as if the weight of his emotions made him less grounded in reality. "You belong to me." She backed away again, her hands trembling. "Ethan, please. I can't do this anymore." In a fit of rage, he grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip painful. "You don't get to leave me, not after everything we've been through." His breath came in shallow, frantic gasps as he tightened his hold, his fingers pressing into her skin. "I'm sorry," she begged, her voice breaking. "Please." But he wasn't listening. The man she had once trusted, the man who had once been her escape, was no longer there. Instead, he was someone dark, uncontrollable. His eyes locked on hers, but there was no recognition, only madness. "I won't let you go," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Before she could react, Ethan's hand shot out, grabbing a knife from the kitchen counter. Her scream was choked off by his grip on her throat as he raised the blade. The room seemed to freeze as Ethan's fury took over. In a single motion, he lunged. Catherine didn't have time to process it, didn't have time to scream again. The sharp sting of the knife in her side sent shockwaves through her body. She stumbled backward, falling against the floor, gasping for air, her hands clutching at her side, the blood pooling around her. Ethan stood above her, staring down in a trance-like state, his eyes vacant, his hand still holding the knife. The room filled with her labored breaths, her voice barely audible as she whispered his name in disbelief. Michael arrived moments later. His mind had been a storm of rage, thoughts clouded with vengeance and hurt. But when he walked through the door, the scene that awaited him brought everything to a halt. There, in the living room, stood Ethan, bloodied, holding the knife. Catherine's body lay motionless on the floor, her face pale, her eyes wide open in a final expression of terror. The room was silent, save for the faint, shaky breath of Ethan as he stared at her lifeless body. Michael froze, his heart racing, a sickening realization dawning on him. For a moment, there was no grief, no sorrow, just the cold, calculated thought of how to protect himself. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he took in the scene. "What happened?" he asked, his eyes flicking from Ethan to the bloodied knife. Ethan's head jerked up, his gaze vacant. I couldn't let her leave me, Michael." Michael stepped closer, his mind working swiftly, formulating a plan. "This isn't about Catherine anymore. This is about survival." Without a word, he moved to Ethan, prying the knife from his grip. And then, coldly, he positioned the body, rearranging it with methodical precision. He wouldn't let this ruin him. He couldn't. His wealth, his reputation, they had to be preserved. Catherine had chosen to betray him, and now her death would be nothing more than collateral damage. He knew exactly what to do to make it all disappear. He stared at them both, as he let them go and walked away. One life destroyed, another saved. The scene was set, and Michael moved swiftly, his heart still numb. The investigation into Catherine's murder began with urgency, but soon slowed to a crawl. Detective Harris arrived at the Langdon estate, combing the scene for evidence. The house was pristine, no forced entry, no signs of struggle, just Catherine's lifeless body. The initial excitement soon faded into frustration. No clear motive emerged, and Michael, the grieving husband, was cooperative but distant. His calm, almost controlled demeanor raised suspicion, yet there was no solid evidence to point to him. The case grew colder by the day as the police hit dead ends. Behind closed doors, Michael used his wealth and connections to manipulate the investigation. His lawyers expertly redirected the police, making it difficult to trace any wrongdoing back to him. The detectives' efforts were stifled by the pressure Michael's influence placed on the case. To the outside world, Michael was simply the devastated husband, but his control behind the scenes cast a darker shadow. His outward composure only made the suspicions grow. Yet, no one could pin anything on him. His power shielded him, and that's all he needed. Then there was Ethan. Just days after Catherine's murder, he vanished. The police scrambled to find him, but he had disappeared without a trace. No one knew where he had gone, and the investigation stalled once more. Was Ethan hiding? Had he run away in fear? His sudden disappearance raised suspicion, and rumors spread like wildfire. Was he involved in Catherine's death? Had he planned to return? As time passed, the whispers around town grew louder. Ethan's absence loomed large, but without any concrete proof of his involvement, the police couldn't make a connection. The case was stalled, and Michael's life carried on, untouched by the unraveling mystery. Despite his ability to evade the law, Michael could not escape the gnawing guilt that consumed him. The memories of Catherine, of her betrayal, and the gruesome act he had covered up, haunted him. At night he would lie awake, his mind racing. The weight of his actions pressed on him, a constant reminder of what he had done to protect his reputation. The perfect life he had built now felt like a fragile house of cards, ready to collapse. His paranoia grew. Was anyone on to him? Could Ethan expose him? Every knock at the door, every phone call made his heart race. His calm, collected exterior was a lie, masking the broken man beneath. As the months wore on, the toll of Catherine's death began to fracture Michael's once perfect world. His empire, built on wealth and status, now felt hollow. Friends and colleagues grew distant, no longer trusting him. His social circle, once a fortress, began to crumble. Michael's guilt was eroding everything he had worked for. The life he had fought to protect was slipping away. Not through legal consequence, but through the self-destructive weight of his choices. He started to feel more and more life was Izzy's. In the end, Michael's victory was a hollow one. The investigation stagnated, Ethan remained missing, and Michael's reputation remained intact. He was legally free, but emotionally, he was a prisoner. The luxury of a perfect life had faded, leaving behind a man haunted by his actions. His wealth, his status, none of it offered comfort. No one knew the truth behind Catherine's death. But Michael's isolation was a punishment that no amount of power could escape. The silence of justice was his only company, and it would follow him forever.